The following is a production of the University of Minnesota.
Can you hear me? Okay, good afternoon. This is the Internationalization Theory to Practice, Practice to Theory session with Dr. Joseph Mestenhauser and Andy Angelo King from the Carlson School of Management and the College of Education and Human Development. And I just need to say that this will be audio taped, so we'll use the microphone for questions at the end, and if you would prefer to write your question on the note cards, I can announce that for you. Okay?
Thank you very much for coming to this session. My name is Joe Mestenhauser, and I am very delighted to be here. The problem is that you can never shut me up when you give me a chance to talk about the curriculum and internationalization. I am also very pleased to introduce my co-host here, Ann King. She has two functions here. One is, of course, to describe and explain the activities in the Carlson School of Management, and the other one is to be a sort of an audiovisual aid to anybody who might be interested in a PhD work to demonstrate that one can survive the field and still be smiling. We have decided to do a little untraditional presentation instead of making a presentation and sitting down and so on. We'll have a little conversation here because we have some questions between the two of us that we want to have answered, and we certainly invite you also to ask any additional questions. We hope to have sufficient time left for a discussion of that. It's a very important topic indeed too. So the first question that I would like to address to Anne, of course, is to explain and to define what the Carlson School is doing, because they have a tremendous name in this field, and I'm really quite puzzled how you got to this point too. Many years ago, one of my colleagues by the name of, can't think of her name now, the guru in international management has been between jobs, and I took the opportunity to, and she was quite interested in coming to Minnesota, so I contacted the dean and the associate's dean, and I was told that they were not interested in any of this intercultural stuff out here, that if anybody wanted it, they should go to anthropology, because there was enough stuff in the School of Management. So things have really changed since my days, and I am delighted to know that this is the case, and I would like you to elaborate on that and tell us how you got to this point. I'm sure you had something to do with that yourself.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mestenhauser, and I just want to express my honor to be here having this conversation. It's actually a continued conversation. Dr. Mestenhauser and I get together regularly, I would say, and the meeting of the minds, but also debating, and it's been very, very interesting. And so we thought this would be an opportunity to broaden our conversation and include you in this discussion. So just in response, to give you a point of reference, I've been at the Carlson School almost 5 years now, and certainly our internationalization efforts started long before then. In the mid-'80s, the dean at that time appointed Mahmoud Zaidi, a faculty member, as the director of a new initiative called, at that time, International Programs Development. And it began, as most things begin, organically. It started out with some faculty initiatives, faculty exchanges, student exchanges that were business school to business school that complemented much of the good work that was being done and continues to be done at the Learning Abroad Center. And then that extended to small research and travel grants to continue to support that commitment, and a co-major in international business, which still exists, and that requires a semester abroad as well as 2 years of language. And it's a co-major, so it's international business and marketing or international business and finance. In the last 5 years, as many of you have probably heard, we also have had requirements that have been voted on by the faculty. And much of that I attribute to a combination of things, the organic nature of all of the different activities that were occurring in the school, but also a variety of champions throughout the school, from faculty to students and staff. Also, at that same time in the mid-'80s, there was a unique grant through the USAID and working closely with Humphrey to begin an executive MBA program in Warsaw, but it was really to begin with the Warsaw professors at the Warsaw School of Economics, where our faculty were working closely with their faculty on revised curriculum for a market economy. And that really was mutual learning that was occurring, and more of our faculty got involved in that effort. So that also brought us to where we are, where we have a requirement for our undergraduates to have an international experience as part of their curriculum. 2 years ago, that was 3 years ago, 2 years ago, our full-time MBAs have an integrated experience, and most recently in December, we voted on our part-time MBAs. So all of our undergraduate students and MBA students now are required, and I am lucky enough to have a team that has grown from about 4 or 5 people to about 12 or 13, where we are overseeing the expansion efforts of working collaboratively with the Learning Abroad Center, with people across the university, in equity and diversity, the International Student and Scholar Services, and a variety of different offices, financial aid, to work on some of the other pieces, especially when it comes to graduate education. So that's a little bit about what we are doing today and continue to do. We also have expanded our executive MBA portfolio from Warsaw, Poland. We also have one in Vienna, which is a regional program, and we recruit folks from the Middle East as well as Eastern Europe. And we have one in Guangzhou, China as well. So we've been in that business about 10, 15 years, and our group also oversees that. So as part of that, that gives you a point of reference as far as where the business school is. And as Dr. Mestenhauser and I talk quite a bit, what does that mean from a theoretical or a conceptual standpoint? And I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and what we're doing and why is it important.
Notice that the title of our presentation is in fact in form of a question, theory or practice or theory. The differences between the inductive and deductive thinking, basically. And we ran into this question when we started thinking about how to organize it. Who was going to start? Should we start with the specific programs, the inductive fashion, like we in fact did? Or should we go with the theory, which is more common, the deductive approach, let's say, in Europe? But I just wanted to point out to you is that we don't want to create the impression that there is a theory on the one hand and the practice on the other hand, because they are very much intertwined, and of course one depends on the other one. But then of course if you go to countries like China or Japan or Korea, Asian country, or Indonesia, you have still a different way of doing it. The reason we formulated this question out here is because we did want to stress the idea is that one of the goals of global education is in fact to enable people to think in different ways of thinking, in particularly non-Western as well. So that is to some extent a beginning of that too. The problem is that when we evaluate courses, for example, we pay a lot of attention to the way that students are accustomed to. And most Americans, of course, are accustomed to the inductive way of thinking, to learning by doing, and so on. So how do you then, in fact, change the whole system of evaluation of the faculty when, in fact, in order to produce a different way of thinking about a subject, you need to also do things that are uncomfortable for the students to learn. So with that kind of brief introduction, I was constantly looking for some theory of the curriculum, and I must say regretfully that there isn't any. In fact, one book was just published very recently by Professor McNeil, and he is staying away from the word of theory. He's using things like perspectives on the curriculum, or outlook, or way of looking at the curriculum and so forth, because curriculum is actually a very complex kind of thing. And so when people say that we internationalize the curriculum, I don't think they know exactly how to conceptualize that too. Most American, that is the US, ways of explaining the curriculum is in structural terms. Curriculum is a structure that the institutions put together and students fill by themselves. That's our optional system, our unit, our credit system, our modular system, which encourages that. I have been more impressed, and incidentally, it's a method of looking at that from mostly primary and secondary education, because very few people are writing about higher educational curriculum. That's dominated very much by academic freedom, and so it's very difficult to structure it that way too. But the British have done quite a good work, and I wonder if you can get that slide out there to give the definition that the British are using, because that one is much more meaningful to me, and I would like to, the underlined parts of that are the ones that I want you to particularly notice. You see that they do put an attention on the subject matter that we teach. And much of the evaluation that I have seen is oriented not to the subject matter. In fact, many of the tests that they claim to study global awareness and so on neglect actual knowledge of the subject matter, and yet that's what students come to the university. So the subject matter is the one, and of course my perspective is that every subject matter, every course we offer has an international or global dimension, and that is what I think our function should be to look at too. Then secondly, of course, the curriculum also means students' conceptions, and sometimes preconceptions or misconceptions of that too. Now that's something that a professor, for example, cannot control, and yet the prior knowledge of the students is very important. That's why when you teach, for example, you get different answers on your tests, because the students have different levels of readiness for that subject, and they bring into it, of course, much of their preconceptions as well too. And finally, I think the outcome is whatever cognitive change happens. There are basically two changes. One of them is in learning. That's how much people actually know, and that is the problem that we have. You know, how much have we really conveyed, and how much of that the students are going to remember. That's one of the big problems we have in education. But the other one is in development. By this people mean cognitive development. Cognitive development is basically subject matter free, but it is developing up to a level of abstract reasoning, for example, that we certainly encourage and expect that the graduates of our institutions are going to come up with. And that's very important, because when we talk about the future for which international education is supposed to serve, that future is what we already know is the knowledge society, innovation society, and I would like to add to it conceptualization, because the higher level of occupation that you reach will require a great deal more conceptualization. That's abstract reasoning. Professor Keegan at Harvard has just published recently a book in which he claims that the demands that are being made on people's cognitive resources in this time and age are so many that most people, in fact, are out of it. And the title of his book is, in fact, In Over Our Heads. And he claims that, in fact, the undergraduate curriculum itself is designed for only a third level of cognitive development, when perhaps we need to reach at least the fifth level of cognitive. We don't have time, obviously, to go into it. And again, as I said, that is free of discussion of a subject matter that is considering mostly things like cognitive skills on the abstract level, taking into account other perspectives and things like that. They do all have relevance to international education. Can you get the next slide? So then the same British source that I took that definition from is revealing another very interesting aspect, that is the feature of the curriculum, is that it's, the curriculum is specified. This is what the professor says that he or she will do. You know, that's where you get the syllabus, and the syllabus says, I'm going to teach critical thinking of students and so on. Enacted curriculum is what the faculty member actually does. And then the third one is how the students experience that. And the people who study the behavior of the faculty and the students claim that there is a lot of difference and gaps between these two. In other words, what faculty people say they do is in fact maybe different between what they actually do in the course. There are good reasons for it, because teaching is a very tough job. And I had many jobs at the university, and teaching was the last one before I retired and so on. And I do appreciate that, because it's a totally different situation than you face, because it's unpredictable. The dynamics of the classroom are difficult, and they force the faculty member to think more of short-term goals and neglect the long-term educational outcomes and learning outcomes of the students. Now, that is one of the reasons why, for example, the organization, the AACU, American Association of Colleges and Universities, which is the foremost advocate for liberal and general education, has claimed that only 7% of graduate of our institutions are critical thinkers, and yet most faculty people claim that this is the primary intellectual skill that they teach. So theory is here, and the problem is that there are too many of these theories that relate to the curriculum: learning, teaching, memory, functioning of the brain, and things like that. And I've been doing a lot of reading across the board, and I'm doing some writing about that now to indicate the complexity of it and the need to connect different kinds of theories to bear on this. And the problem, as I see it, is that most faculty people have no idea about learning theories, about teaching theories, and about functioning of the brain and things like that. That's not how they have been prepared. And we'll eventually come to this question then, who is going to teach the teachers? So Anne, can you continue out here a little bit with this discussion? You are a person from education, not from management and so on, and I have often heard business people say that you don't really understand business unless you are a businessman. How do they treat you there? How, are you well accepted? Are you a stranger? Or do faculty, in fact, respect you and your views? I would be very interested to know that.
Well, I think as with being a part of, and my boss is out there laughing, so I better... as with joining any organization, it took some time to understand, what the various cultures within the organization were about, and how things functioned, and how people thought about the international things that we were doing. And as I said, we had a handful of people just about 5 years ago, and so it was coming in and really getting to know and learn what it is that we were doing. one thing I wanted to emphasize was, as I mentioned in the beginning, about the context of the Carlson School and what's been occurring along that time as well, was working with the university on the curriculum integration project and having many of our faculty involved, which also really contributed quite a bit to the expansion of those efforts and our faculty getting to know more and more about what it means to be internationalized. This framework is something that is emerging in the field in business education or management education, and it hasn't always been easy as far as being coming out of education and human development, but also I've always worked in business education, whether for the U.S. government or for nonprofits and that sort of thing. And so I'm used to interacting quite a bit with corporations. So it was really, as this framework, which is somewhat similar to Knight or DeWitt, thinking about the larger university internationalization framework, I thought it was interesting that curriculum is really at the center of that. And we talk about people and processes and those kinds of things. And I wanted to mention the MBA internationalization framework because just like undergraduate education, which we often talk about, there is an entire discourse as well about MBA internationalization, the indirect and direct global exposure. And when we talk about it in the context of business, I think we're saying similar things, but we're using different words and we're positioning things in different ways. So for example, you'll notice in some of those pieces on the slide talking about what is the competitive advantage of having these international experiences or study abroad or that kind of thing. Or when we're talking about faculty hiring and retooling, are we talking about development? Faculty introducing a lot of business cases. I mean, really, business and our faculty, we can't ignore the fact that globalization is occurring and we need to be talking about the discipline. We need to be talking about marketing in an international context. We need to be talking about operations management, supply chain, outsourcing, strategic expansion efforts, and those sorts of things. And to what you've said, Dr. Mestenhauser, some faculty, most faculty, I mean, really know a lot about it in their own discipline. And really the role of our team as we're developing more and more short-term programs, which tend to be more of the trend, and I'm going to bring up the next slide, in MBA education, is really working closely with the faculty member on that curriculum development to say, how can we enhance the academic content by visiting with corporations, having students visit sites and speak directly with the people who are on the ground and doing marketing. Or if we do a live case project, for example, we work with International Dairy Queen, who is introducing and wanting to expand their market of the blizzard in Shanghai. So how do you do that? And so recently the MBA Roundtable, which is a prominent association and one of our former colleagues from the Carlson School is the executive director, recently did a survey about the various curricular approaches, and it really did focus on short-term programs. And I know those of us who are purists say, but if you're going to really become more globally competent, you need to immerse yourself. And I certainly would agree with that, but sometimes the curriculum is somewhat of a barrier to that. And so if we need to start with the shorter term, and that might mean, in our context at the Carlson School, you start a class such as Accounting 3001, which is a core class, classroom sessions here in Minnesota, and then our class with the faculty member go to Argentina, and they learn more in academic sessions, and they meet with businesses to talk a little bit about how that really plays out. And these are the different ways that it's talked about in the field. And I thought it was interesting that 70% of the respondents to the MBA Roundtable survey had some kind of a formal requirement. And that could be a course. You have to take an international business course. It could be an international experience, such as ours, but I think that's few and far between. So it's changing quite a bit. I also wanted to put up a couple of key case examples, just, and this will be available to you on the online portal, and we've been putting together an array of bibliography sources and that sort of thing, so no need to worry. But these are a variety of different consulting models, multicultural team models. We at the Carlson School develop and try to incorporate as much cultural learning as possible. Our students being put in teams with Chinese students to work on a real challenge for a company like International Dairy Queen. How do we do this? And in that context, the Chinese students helped with language. Certainly we need to, I was in the Carla presentation, we need to do more with language. We thought about introducing some language professors to work with our professors. So there's always more to do. I thought the Northwestern model was interesting where it's student-driven. You have students who are developing certain models and planning and executing the types of coursework, and we're there to help facilitate and integrate specific cultural components, language components, a variety of different things to enhance that learning and also to enhance our own learning. So when Dr. Messenhauser and I have spoken about the practical examples and the theoretical models, we've talked a lot about being informal and formal, deliberate and accidental. And all of those things are happening at the same time, and it's highly complex. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to really think differently and reimagine or recreate what it is that we're really doing, taking a step back like we emphasize with our students to reflect on the work that we are doing. It isn't just about the administrative work and the logistics and getting from point A to point B, but it's also about conceptually what are we doing? And do we know what we're doing, and are we setting those goals? And I think a lot of us are, but it's so complex that we and time-wise, we don't have time to really acknowledge the good work that we are doing. So we talked a little bit about this idea of global mindset, and I know you've read quite a bit about this concept, and I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
This is an interesting concept for me. Many years ago, we had a project how to develop critical thinking, and one of the gurus in critical thinking is Bob Ennis. And he came up with the concept which he calls dispositions. Dispositions are mindsets of people. They could be positive or they could be negative. And he claimed that there is no critical thinking to begin with without a positive disposition to be fair, to consider other perspectives and things like that. So that is the disposition. So basically, if there is no disposition, there is no critical thinking. And I'm trying to borrow this concept out here too, because I think that the problem with the theory and practice idea is that most people, in fact, do have a theory in mind, even if they don't know what it is or what name it has. It's implicit theory. Most faculty people do, you and I do. And so these mindsets are things that I have been concerned about, and I have actually been collecting a series of these mindsets. For example, Joan Gore had published a book recently about the mindsets of people towards study abroad, and that's the same kind of idea. There is also the more positive, the global mindset, and it's interesting because it comes out of a book published and edited by a Minnesota PhD who is now at Thunderbird, I guess. It's called just that, the global mindset. And I am quite impressed by this dimension of that because it's got striking similarity between what you people do and what I used to do as international education professionals. One of the chapters in this book is defining the functions of CEOs of the top international and global corporations. If you look at these, the mindset of these people and the functions, they are almost identical to what you people do. And I think that this is really one of the reasons I have been so interested in developing professionalism among international education professionals out here. Because of the question I posed earlier, who is going to teach the teachers? We have from philosophy or social sciences, for example, a suggestion. Most of the hardcore social sciences, as you know, came from philosophy. So there is, in fact, a branch of philosophy called philosophy of social sciences, and they identify the different disciplines by either the first or the second discourse. Basically what that means is that, for example, in politics, the field of politics, the practical field of politics is the first discourse, and political science is the field that studies the field. Therefore, it's a second order of discourse. But the same is true is in education, in management, certainly in economics and so on. But there is nothing like that in education, and in fact, it would have to be a third order of discourse, because the international educators speak not only who speaks to the profession, and who speaks also to the other disciplines. Because, you know, that's what I think is the problem, because most professional people get stuck with a particular administrative job description, and that's the one that you have to pursue. But in fact, most people are educators, and they practice education. They, even in counseling, for example, it's an educational venture. And it's not being recognized sufficiently, and I think it certainly should be. So this kind of a mindset is the global mindset that I am certainly promoting, and I'm doing some writing about that. Incidentally, there is a new law that was just passed that requires, due to commercialization of higher education, that a very program about international education has to have at least one commercial. And so that commercial for me is that there is going to be a substantially enhanced web page of the Office of International Programs, and that's where you are going to find more of these slides and so on. One of them I'd like to call your attention to, that's the future needs, learning needs.
Oh, okay.
And that I think is if you can find that too.
You're challenging my...
Yeah.
Okay.
There. You know, if we say that international education is for the future, first of all, people's capacity to predict the future is very limited. And that is also true even of things like sophisticated strategic planning, which some people claim is really for the present, not for the future. And so these are some of the needs, and I challenge any faculty person to see whether they actually teach some of these kinds of skills. They would be intellectual skills out here, and they are, of course, a great many beyond the critical thinking, creative thinking. My own interest is in comparative thinking, and these are higher level skills. What troubles me mostly is that international education is defined primarily in terms of undergraduate education. But I think it's equally needed, in fact even more so, in graduate education, because that's where knowledge is being produced. That's where all these strategic needs are being produced. I'm just reading a book on the failures of the CIA, for example, and one of the chapters in the book is asking that a new academic discipline on the highest level of sophistication be created, which will be called intelligence analysis. And that is, in fact, what I think we also need to be striving. It's not just for undergraduate students out here. Well, and what should we leave the audience with?
Oops.
We have
just a few more minutes. I just want to mention that in management education, our accrediting body, AACSB, has teamed up with, and this has been in existence for a while, with the European Foundation of Management Development. I'm not sure, for those who aren't in business, if you would know that, and I think that helps to also support the internationalization efforts. And these are some of the challenges just looking to the future, and the future is something that is expected of business schools to be leading and also working closely with corporations on leading their efforts in research and development and that sort of thing. And some of the things about the quality assurance, there's a lot that's occurring in management education, but how do we get our arms around it, and how do we explain it? How do we communicate about it? Not unlike the learning outcomes that we've talked a lot about across the university and capturing the internationalization. Dr. Mestenhauser, we talked a lot about the culture being at the center and all of the cognition and the systems thinking and the future thinking and leadership and these types of things that we have a number of sources that we'll share with you online that support all of these different things. But again, just a challenge to you, which supports what Meredith said over lunch about we have students coming in, we hope more and more students coming in that are these first globals that are very knowledgeable. And if we as administrators and educators and faculty members and we need to continue to keep learning, but we also need to think about our roles, as I mentioned earlier, in a different way. And I just challenge you to, the field is only as professional as we make it and we define it. And so for those of you who are presenting at different conferences and things like that, not just about the practical programs, but what about the theoretical and conceptual frameworks? When you're having those conversations with faculty or faculty who are here asking of our colleagues. I know we've had some good conversations too with some of our undergraduate advisors about just student development theory and about learning theory and that sort of things and that mutual learning that occurs. Also, universities have not yet confronted the importance of the international education field. I think we're lucky to be here at the University of Minnesota and be at this first ever conference and have all these people here, but there's still a lot more to do. And with that, we wanted to open it up and ask if you have any feedback or questions.
This little chart represents 10 of the most difficult concepts to teach. And like the interdisciplinarity, for example, is very difficult. You know, most people have multidisciplinary presentations. Somebody gets up and says, I am a political scientist, and this is what I think, and somebody else is economist, and so on. The interdisciplinarity requires, like in understanding other culture, concept sharing, and so that's why it's so difficult. Somebody predicted or anticipated that it takes about a semester of intensive work to be able to understand the language of another discipline. However, there is a silver lining that once you acquire that knowledge, the next discipline will take only about a week of instruction. So you see, I think we need to also find in international education ways of accelerating that learning. And conceptual thinking, for example, is one of those. Study abroad is another one of those areas, not yet fully realized. So I think...
You have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Professor Mestenhauser, I have a question about more like a conceptual framework. It seems like a professional school try to advance the programs to meet the professional demand. So I'd say like a professional school is somehow different from general college, like social science or natural sciences. When we promote internationalization in professional schools, do we have to be careful some lessons, or do we have to organize some framework teams? Also, from your perspective, what would be the effective way to promote internationalization in professional schools, such as business schools or law school?
Well, I think, you know, I actually would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Dr. Houston, for example, and Anne on the fantastic, I would call it a leap for mankind almost in business school, because during my days that was the most difficult field to internationalize. And now you see where they are going. They are way ahead, requiring study abroad, for example, of all undergraduates and so on. Now, I think one of the biggest difficulties from my point of view is this focus on the competition idea, because, you know, that competitiveness, you know, most people say is also a form of cooperation, but I don't believe it. Competitiveness is, in fact, to gain advantages for yourself that somebody else also wants and doesn't get. So I think that all the social psychological literature indicates that competitiveness is in fact breeding prejudice and so on, and that would be one of the problems. And I think the other one is the instrumentality of the professional fields, particularly business. Profit is profit, business is business, and so on. And I think that this needs to be tempered somehow, because if everybody becomes to be competitive, then it sort of cancels itself all out, then it becomes meaningless, I think. So I would like to see much more content on cooperation, for example, in business, and some of that is happening actually already on the level of the most active multinational corporations, that while they compete, they also simultaneously cooperate, and I think that this is in fact happening even within the country as well. I don't know if I have answered your question, but two of the most difficult fields, there are both professional fields to internationalize, are unfortunately education and journalism, because they are responding to a particular mindset of people, and they are very much living in the past, preserving tradition and relating to people. I have real problems with internationalization of the colleges of education.
Well, and I do want to just add one thing. I think the more so-called champions or people that you have involved, you're going to have your naysayers, but you're also going to have people who have direct experiences, whether it's in their classroom. And I think that's what's occurred at the Carlson School. We may have a central office, but not every activity is necessarily coming out of that office. So you have faculty who are champion certain things, you have other program offices or the dean's office doing other things, and so everyone rallies behind that effort. And just a point on competition, I think there is a silver lining. I do think that you could talk about it in terms of differentiation. I remember when we first were talking about the requirement with parents and undergraduates, and I personally thought we'd get a lot more pushback from parents than I expected. And we haven't really gotten much pushback. I think the expectation is if my student is going to be studying and coming out of a top business school, then absolutely they need to be learning these kinds of things. And so a parent said, rather than my student maybe going to Europe, which I was strongly encouraging to study abroad as differentiating themselves as they're being recruited by top companies and that sort of thing, now they're going to have to do two. They're going to have to go to Europe and they're going to have to go to Asia or something like that. And of course, that's music to our ears. But those are the kinds of, I think, positive things that really emphasize the trend and the importance of the experience, but also I want to comment on language and those kinds of things. And we have more and more students also talking a lot about the languages and how can I participate in a program and use my language ability in Spanish or Japanese or whatever it is. Mm-hmm.
I am looking at that, I'm sorry about that. I am looking at that slide with culture in the middle, and you said, is your name Ann? Maybe you were at the presentation about languages. Mm-hmm. We would argue that language and culture are integrally linked, and I'm wondering in the Carlson School exactly how you're viewing that. My department head at UMD said several years ago, it's easy if you want to buy something in English now, try and sell something and do it convincingly. Yeah? That's difficult. Mm-hmm. For Americans mm-hmm. in another language. You said the curriculum is the barrier. Maybe only because we think it's the barrier, because we write the curriculum. What is Carlson doing with languages so that we can meet other people in other nations in their language on their terms?
Good question. Well, I think there's as we've talked about, this is a very complex issue, all of these issues and all of these things that are up here. How does Carlson see this? I think first and foremost, having the commitment to say that we want our students to go abroad in some international experience is a step in the right direction for undergraduate students and MBA students. And I want to commend the faculty for really doing that and doing that almost unanimously. Within that, and when we speak with corporate folks, we get mixed messages about that. We get, well, English is the language of business. And we hear that from a variety of different people. But we also hear, yes, but we really miss a lot of the conversation at the boardroom table, or when we're out at dinner and things like that, because we're not learning certain things. So my personal theory about that is that as the students are coming up and coming up the ranks with more and more language ability coming out of these immersion programs and that sort of things, and we're working closely with Elaine and others throughout the university to talk about the language departments and that sort of thing. We do have an international business co-major where it does require, I think it's 2 years, right, Jan? 2 years of language. I do feel very good about that. We have more and more students that are taking that co-major because of the language and because of the semester exchange. So there are a lot of good things that are occurring, but I also think that there's a shift that's occurring culturally within management education, within the organization and the school, business school framework, as well as just in corporate America. And it's not going to happen overnight, but I happen to think that we're on the right track and we're doing some really good things. It's also great to hear from students directly, and we're trying to do more and more videos and that kind of thing directly from students about how they've been able to use their language or the culture learning that's happening, and then coming back and wanting to take a language or wanting to do more. And so does that answer your question? We don't have a distinct goal at this point, but we have been working very closely recently on our learning outcomes as they relate to our accreditation and that kind of thing. And I think that also will uncover those kinds of things.
I think there are two concepts that I have been quite interested in too. One of them is motivation. Motivation is between learning and personality. And I think that's very important for us to really cultivate. How do you motivate people to learn a foreign language? Without which, for example, that emic and ethic and the thinking of other people is impossible. I took a course one time in the Philippines about the Filipino language, that showed how people think in terms of the Filipino language, what terms they had, what they didn't even have. In my own native language, in the Czech, there is no concept of leadership, and I was trying to give a lecture about cross-cultural perspective on leadership. That's an abstract term, great difficulty. The other concept is meta-learning, and I think that's what most faculty neglect also. And meta-learning is learning about learning. It's a very complex concept, I think, and it also sort of directs your way of thinking about language. It's too difficult, therefore, I'm not going to touch it. And English is sufficient, you rationalize that too. I've been often recommending that we give to incoming freshmen some sort of a language aptitude test to show them that, in fact, they have an aptitude to learn the language, because it's not too late yet, even if they didn't have much background in the high schools, for a foreign language. And perhaps I will talk to Elaine about that as well, to see if some sort of a language about language course might be also suitable as part of the curriculum that would sort of motivate people to want to learn a foreign language. There is a lot of difference between the effort that you have to make to learn, let's say, Korean or Arabic language and so on, and much less the Spanish. That's why Spanish is such a popular language. But we need to do more thinking about language. And Senator Simon used to say that we are deaf and blind to languages, and that's a shame.
And I think in closing on that motivation piece, we are conducting some research right now about the motivation of our students not under the requirement This goes back with sophomores, juniors, and seniors not under the undergraduate requirement, and we hope to have some of the findings of that very soon. But you know, a lot of business schools talk about graduating globally competent leaders, and I think we're doing it right at the Carlson School by saying that one of our goals is to instill the motivation for students and faculty and staff to want to become more globally competent. I think that's more accurate, and I think these experiences, whether it's studying a language, whether it's going abroad, whether it's really getting knee-deep into an international case or interacting with more and more of our international students who are directly enrolling or exchange students, really intrigues them to want to learn more. And I think on that, just also asking all of you to think about what it is that you're doing and whether there are opportunities to do some research on that or connect with a faculty member to say, you know, why are we doing what we're doing, or would this have a research element in the context of whatever the discipline is? So.
And before, I like to have the last word, I guess, and so I'd like to express my congratulations to Gail Woodruff for organizing this conference. You are doing the kind of thing that I have only been dreaming about, and the direction that you are going is, I think, exactly what needs to be done, and I think that needs to be recognized, and I certainly appreciate your own interest in it as well. And please think of yourself as being educators who are doing the most exceptional and unusual kind of a job that people don't really appreciate, and part of the problem is that we don't explain ourselves well enough. Thank you very much for being here.